Cormac O'Brien is the author of Secret Lives of U.S. Presidents, Strange Stories and Shocking Trivia from Inside the White House. His book provides readers hundreds of little-known, politically incorrect, and downright wacko facts about America's commanders-in-chief.
We rely on very ordinary people to be our head of state, and they bring with them all of these foibles and baggage, sometimes violent pasts.
In a recent phone conversation, he spoke about presidents who have visited Idaho and one who hasn't. He also told us who he feels is the worst president in history.
I don't think we've ever had a more venal man in the office.
I'm Rhett Nelson, and today a conversation with Cormac O'Brien. First of all, I gotta ask you, what was the how did this book come about? What was the inspiration behind this?
The inspiration lay with a fellow named Jason Rikublak, who was a friend of mine years ago. Well, he still is, but we were when this happened years ago. We worked together as copywriters at the Book of the Month Club, and he went on to become an editor at Court Books, and they wanted to do some strange, irreverent political stuff. He gave me a call because he knew that I was a writer, that he liked my stuff, and that I was also a huge history junkie, and I would leap at this. So we had a phone call. He said, we're looking to do something on the presidents, and after a few back and forths, this is what we came up with.
Wow. And so this book was published in 2017, but as you were putting research together to write it, what were some of the most surprising things that you discovered?
Well, it actually, the original edition came out in, I believe, 2004, and we've been updating it through several iterations ever since. So that's how far back it goes. And almost every presidency since we've tried to update it. And from the beginning, one of the things that I found most interesting is how what emerges is kind of an ironic celebration of the American system of government, in which we rely on very, very ordinary people, men so far, to be our head of state. And they bring with them all of these foibles and baggage, sometimes violent pasts. And it's important to remember that these guys are not only the head of government. In other words, they're the guys who are chief executives and trying to get things done on the ground and overseas through foreign policy. But they're also the face of the nation. They are our head of state. For example, and of course, the UK, you have the Queen, who is the head of state. And she's a symbol that everyone can look to for good or ill. And we don't have that. The head of government and the head of state are the same. And he's an elected face, and it makes for some messy collisions in that regard, because that means that something like half the country at any given time didn't vote for our head of state and probably don't want him there. So the symbolism gets murky through that, I think. But through the book, what I loved was that these guys are ordinary and weird, and just like the rest of us, and yet they're elevated to the highest office in the land, the most powerful position in the world, despite all those things. Or maybe one could say because of them in some sense.
Yeah. So overall, has this book project increased or decreased your esteem for the office of the president?
I think it's increased it, because again, I've always believed that political systems, like legal systems, are inherently imperfect because they involve human agency, and we're imperfect. So all we can do is try to get the best balance of representation and authority that we can as a nation. And I think our Constitution is a mess in many ways and weak in certain ways, but it's brilliant in others. And the office of the president, I think, is one of those things that I think we've more or less gotten it right, as right as we could as a nation. And of course, it has evolved. The way the people in, say, the 1820s viewed the presidency is very different from the way that we today view the presidency. So it has evolved, and I think it's evolved more or less under the circumstances. It's become more powerful, for one thing. But I think the way we do this, I think the presidency rightly holds a lot of respect from people.
Talk about that evolution a little bit. How has it evolved over the years? What's changed, and as far as how we regard the president?
Well, you mentioned in some of the things you might want to touch on what I thought might be an underrated president. Excuse me. And this brings us to your point, to your question about the evolution, because one of the most underrated presidents, in my opinion, is William McKinley. It's not that he's forgotten. Certainly presidential historians know a lot about him and have written extensively about him, but most people don't recall the significance of McKinley's administration right around the turn of the 20th century. And what's important about him is that he's the first real, he establishes under his administration the beginnings of the American empire. And this is an empire just like European empires at the time. We end up going to war with Spain over a preposterous accident, the explosion of the main battleship in Cuba. And that was due to an accidental circumstance that was common in coal-fired ships at the time. But the United States didn't know for a fact that was the case, and they didn't have the forensics to prove either way, so they just blamed it on the Spanish because Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire. And so you have Remember the Maine, and we go to war with Spain. And in the course of that war, we acquire a geographical empire that includes Cuba and the Philippines and other important places. And suddenly we're playing the imperial game. And the president, he didn't have to do that. He did so as commander-in-chief, and he led the charge. Although he was coy about it. He didn't really, he wasn't exactly a bellicose figure. But I think ultimately he saw this as an opportunity, and he finagled it through, and the nation went along with him. And what happens is with McKinley, and this would come about much more obviously with his successor, Theodore Roosevelt, is that now you have an imperial presidency, and instead of just the chief executive, who is the guy who sits in the White House and signs bills and has generals answer to him, now he's the face of the nation, and in many ways the most important of the three branches of government. He's out front, and he's leading and he's directing affairs in a way that would have been uncomfortable to the founders, because they were wary of executive power and its abuses, obviously. But with empire comes increased executive authority, presence, and a celebrity in a certain way. And now presidents are able to get away with things going into the 20th century that would have been inappropriate beforehand. And it's really with McKinley that begins to happen, and it comes because of the acquisition of empire.
In speaking of just how things have evolved over the years, I certainly appreciate those comments, but I've also heard that, back in the early history of our country, the way we viewed campaigns was much different. But presidents weren't out and about. They didn't necessarily travel from town to town and from state to state to earn votes. It was believed that the office of the president was a very dignified thing, and that the president shouldn't be, on the public stage per se. Is that a correct perception of how it's kind of evolved?
That's exactly right. And dignity is a good word. It was a dignified office, and it was very undignified to do anything besides conduct what people refer to as a front porch campaign. People might come to your house, almost as a pilgrimage if you were a really popular candidate. And they might stand outside, and you might come out on your porch and answer some questions and give a brief speech and say thanks for coming, and maybe even serve some lemonade and refreshments. But you're right. There was no stumping, and I think what changes is the celebrity and the ubiquity of American presidential presence with modern media. That certainly allows it to explode. But for example, Theodore Roosevelt, to go back to him, what's interesting is that his wife, Edie, was the first presidential spouse, the first lady to have a small staff, and it was very small, on the government dime. And she used that staff to very carefully control her husband's photo ops and his interaction with the media. No photographs were taken of Theodore Roosevelt without her having said, "Okay, that's a good one," or having her okay. And she watched that like a hawk and controlled in many ways his image and the cultivating of his image. And of course he was a stumper. And that's because by that time cameramen and newspapers and the public had all begun to be fascinated with the president in a way that made front porch campaigns impossible, a thing of the past. You were going to have to go out, otherwise your opponent was going to take advantage of your face being all over the place, and you were going to lose. And it's a changing of the times, really.
Yeah. Well, so with our listening audience, our audience is based in eastern Idaho, and so I was curious about in your research, any fun facts or stories about presidents' ties to Idaho. So Idaho was signed into statehood in 1890 by Benjamin Harrison, and you were telling me before we started this interview that every president since Benjamin Harrison has been through the state of Idaho at least once, except for one. And who was that?
Donald Trump. Well, every president since Lyndon Johnson has been to Idaho except Donald Trump. And I think in Trump's calculation, he thought he didn't have to during his presidency, because so much of what was important to Trump was his popularity and image. And I don't think he was going to, he felt, or his staff probably more accurately, felt he was going to lose anything by not going. I think he would have gone if he felt his numbers slipping in Idaho. But Idaho, I think, as far as he was concerned, was not an issue, because it wasn't so much governance as it was how he felt people felt about him, his backers, his party felt about him across the country. And in Idaho, he didn't have a problem with it. So.
Wow. So earlier you were mentioning the most underrated president, which you mentioned was McKinley. I'm interested, what, from your perspective, who's the most colorful or flamboyant president we've ever had?
Well, there are a few candidates. I was thrilled researching Andrew Jackson, who by the time he became president had fought in numerous scores, literally, of duels during his adult career, both as a law student and a lawyer and a politician. In fact, he, as president, had a bullet lodged in his chest close to his heart that would give him, from a duel, that would give him health problems throughout his presidency and for the rest of his life. A violent man who once defended himself in the Capitol Dome from an attacker who came up to him with a pistol, and all Jackson had was his cane, and he beat the bejeebers out of this guy before the guy could get a shot off, and until help came from passersby who wrestled the guy to the ground. It's a fascinating guy, and of course there's LBJ, who was a character, I think, frankly, a bully, very much an off-color sense of humor. He had the habit of, for example, talking to staffers in the White House. And he didn't want to miss anything ever. It was all business all the time. He was constantly politicking. So if he had to go to the bathroom, he would do so with the bathroom door open, and he insisted on carrying on the conversation with the staffer under those circumstances. He was famous for this sort of thing. And I think the one who wins out has got to be Theodore Roosevelt, who, at least in my opinion, is probably the truest Renaissance man we had as president. I mean, this is a guy who famously went out west in the wake of his daughter's death. This is before he's president. He's a prominent politician, and his daughter's death ruins him. He leaves his child with his sister and goes off to become a cowpoke, and he succeeds brilliantly at this. This Harvard-educated, bespectacled intellectual in the purest sense. There's a funny story. He used to get ribbed by his fellow cowboys when they were herding cattle out west, because he would use language like "hasten forward quickly there" to get one of his fellow cowboys to go wrangle a bull or a cow, and they were like, "Come on, man, lose the Eastern affectation." And he also some guy once started a fight with him at a bar out west, and he bashed the guy to bits. 3 punches, 1, 2, 3, and everybody knew not to mess with the guy with the glasses. But this is also a guy who went, he wrote prolifically. I still have a copy upstairs of his. I mean, obviously, it's a new paperback. It's still in print. That's the point of his history of the naval war of the War of 1812, which is still standard reading if you're reading up on the War of 1812. He did this. I don't know how far out of college he was, but it was long before he became a prominent politician, and he just loved the subject, dove into it, did research on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's still one of many that he wrote. He wrote naturalist books that were highly regarded. Hunter, martial artist, famously got into a boxing match in the White House while president. He used to box, and he invited some officer from the Navy, and I can't remember the guy's name. But this guy was a very good boxer, and the president insisted on boxing with him. And the guy landed a haymaker on the president's face that blinded Roosevelt in his eye, and he was humiliated. He didn't tell anybody this for a very long time, but he was blind in that eye for I think months. I don't think you can find a more colorful president in our history than TR.
And he historically he had this romantic view of the West, and particularly loved, in our neck of the woods, he loved to visit Yellowstone National Park, from things that I've read. And so there was something about the American West that he just was enthralled by.
Very much so, and he's responsible for starting a lot of those national parks. He was the classic hunter/naturalist who understood the wealth, the natural wealth and sheer beauty that America had, and that it should be protected. It shouldn't be ruthlessly exploited. Some of it would inevitably be, but much of it must be protected. And he's the guy who starts this, and he's passionate about it. And of course, he hated the name Teddy, by the way. People call him Teddy. They continue to call him Teddy Roosevelt. He hated it personally, preferred Theodore. And but of course, he, as a bear hunter, it was the toy manufacturer came out with a toy bear that they famously called Teddy Bear, because everybody knew the guy had famously not taken out a couple of grizzlies. And he was an extraordinary hunter. And the teddy, that's where we get the teddy bear, is from TR's association with brown bears, and a toy manufacturer taking advantage of it, something you see throughout actually presidential history. But yes, his connection not just to American nature, but to American nature in the West, which brought him out there again and again and again, is something fundamental to his whole outlook and personality.
I'm interested in just kind of the timeline. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president after the assassination of William McKinley, and this is in the year 1901, right at the turn of the century. It's interesting to me how, when you like historians, they kind of, when they look back on presidential history, obviously Abraham Lincoln is one of the most prominent, going back to the Civil War time. But then they kind of skip through the rest of the 1800s, and the next one that they discuss, at least in most detail, is Theodore Roosevelt. But there was a whole slew of interesting presidential historical things that happened between the time of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, and yet that's not something we ever learn extensively about. Any interesting presidents during this period of time that you want to talk about between Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt?
I think they're all interesting in their own way. In many ways, I think the phenomenon you're talking about is a reflection more of the age than of the presidents themselves. And broadly speaking, we can call it the Gilded Age. You have Reconstruction, of course, which is something
right.
That's a fascinating and in many ways tragic subject. And after that, you get the Gilded Age, where in the wake of the Civil War, the American economy heats up. America is now the most potent industrial power on Earth, which is incredible given its relative youth. Already, it's producing steel and other commodities in colossal amounts that are dwarfing. It's not dwarfing, but certainly Germany is close behind and other nations. But it has overtaken its European rivals. It's a huge mercantile powerhouse. The East Coast is, all of its cities are hubs, entrepôts for trade with the world. And the economy is just running away, and it's a lot of wealthy robber barons are running away with it. And in many ways, presidencies play along, either because they don't know any better or because the system doesn't really afford them an alternative. And a lot of these guys are sort of placeholder presidents. And but beginning with Reconstruction, I think one of our most villainous presidents is the man who inherits the office after Lincoln is assassinated. And this is a fascinating guy, but one of our most tragic presidents, because of course, with Lincoln didn't know precisely what was going to happen in the wake of the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of African Americans across the nation. He didn't really know how that was going to turn out, but he was willing to try and make it work and make freedmen, not just people who were no longer de jure slaves, but were no longer de facto slaves as well. And so President Johnson, the new president, is a tailor by trade. He was taught to read by his wife. He is not a very smart man. He's not a very interesting man. And he's an angry bigot. And he has no time for black people. And famously, not long after he inherits the office, he receives a party of prominent African-American leaders who are basically trying to sound out where the new president is at. And he basically just dictates to them that he doesn't want to be pushed around. He isn't sure what role blacks have to play in the new country, in the post-war country, and in many ways, it's because of his anemic Reconstruction policies that he ends up, long story short, getting impeached. Although he's acquitted by one vote, but it's kind of a missed opportunity with Johnson, and it's too bad. And then Reconstruction itself ends up going forward, despite him, largely because of his cabinet and Congress, and then of course comes to an abrupt end in 1876. When Rutherford B. Hayes, who acquired basically fewer votes in the popular vote, he comes to an arrangement with his opponent that he gets the presidency, but he's a Republican, and he will end the occupation of the old Confederacy, in effect bringing Reconstruction to an end. This is 1876. It's a turning point in our history, and it's when the rapid rise of the KKK and Jim Crow sort of begins, and it will blossom horribly in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But interesting thing about Rutherford Hayes, he was a teetotaler and a real churchgoer, and he held almost every night religious recitals in the White House during his administration. And his wife became famous as Lemonade Lucy Hayes, because she refused to serve any kind of alcohol whatsoever during the administration as hostess. And there was a bar that ended up getting built not far from the White House, and it was called The Last Chance, because people on their way to a White House function would tuck into The Last Chance to get their last drink in before they had a dry night. But yeah, so that's the Hayes administration and the end of Reconstruction.
During this time, the Gilded Age, so this last presidential election that we had, it ended up being a very contentious election, and a lot of the voting process was highly disputed, and ended up being a conversation that was taken to the Supreme Court. That is not the first time in history that that's happened. There was an election somewhere during this time frame that you've been talking about, where there was an election that actually was determined by the Supreme Court. Which election was that?
Yeah, you know what? Offhand, I don't know. That's a good. I'd have to look that up. But I know in the 1876 election, I don't believe the Supreme Court was involved, and they came to an arrangement themselves between the parties. It was sort of a backroom. So, but do you know that one? Well, actually, offhand.
I do remember one of the candidates. He didn't end up winning, but his name was Samuel Tilden. But I don't remember who his opponent was, and he's the guy who ended up winning.
Oh, it is. No, it was. It was Hayes. Tilden was his opponent.
Oh, okay.
So
okay, yeah. Gotcha.
So I guess I guess the Supreme Court was involved. In what capacity, I'm not sure, because they probably brokered the agreement. But yeah, Tilden was Hayes' opponent. Tilden got the majority of the popular vote. And they came to basically, Tilden wanted an end to Reconstruction. The Democrats back then did. And that's what happened.
So kind of looking at today's political climate, where, there's a lot of talk that it's so divided right now, and it's so contentious, and you hear some people say it's worse than it's ever been. But during this, is this really the worst it's ever been as far as politics and,
I think the best way of looking at it is that it has always been bad. I would say it has always been this bad. The problem is there has been an exception to that, and that was the period from really the end of World War II until probably about 1980. I'd say the election from the end of World War II to the election of Ronald Reagan. Excuse me. And what happens during that period is that the war brings the nation together in a unique way, a way, frankly, that it has never experienced before. It has never experienced since. And it has a great deal to do with the fact that the effort was so colossal and required team playing on such a unique level. Economic, political, military, personal, social. There's nothing like what happened to this country during World War II at any other period. And in the wake of it, in addition to that, you have something else that's unique. Certainly at the time, America is the only nation to emerge out of that war with greater economic prosperity than when they got into it. They're the only nation on Earth, and it's a great deal of economic prosperity. And all these GIs are coming home, and the government lavishes money on their education and settling them well, and the system is elevating everybody. And that swell carries through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, during which you have all kinds of things like, for example, of course, McCarthyism. You have the communist scare. You have people, the parties are bickering, yelling sometimes, fighting, but it's nothing at all like it was during the 19th century and during much of the early 20th century. We used to have a press that was a joke in the early days of the Republic. You could say anything you wanted. Libel laws were loose and often not really prosecuted, and all papers were partisan. It was almost impossible to find an impartial source of information, and they would make stuff up that was crazy, and then you have this thing that happens in the first half of the 20th century, and I think we should be focusing on the circumstances that make that the exception to the rule, rather than talking about the fact that right now we're a nation divided. I think we've always been a nation divided, and for various reasons. Regionally, we were born as a dichotomy. I mean, the difference between slave and free colonies and then states was acute, and it was so acute, and it was so absolute and so unbridgeable that the founding fathers, in all their genius, instead chose to kick the can down the road instead of actually solving it and deciding whether we're going to be one or the other. And the result, of course, ultimately is the Civil War. And between the founding and the Civil War, the country is awash in hatred, animosity, grief, and bloodshed. So that's, I think, the story of our country. And I think the first half of the 20th century is the exception.
There's a lot of hot-button things happening in the world right now that there's a lot of strong opinions about. Of course, the most recent is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We just recently had the pulling out of troops from Afghanistan, and things like this that have happened, and people have some strong opinions about those things. From your perspective of researching for this book, who has been the worst president in U.S. history as far as your opinion, your perspective on that goes?
Well, I mentioned Andrew Johnson, who was, in my opinion, the worst. Although, as I said, the federal government in many ways was able to compensate for his worst failings. Not fully, but the country moved forward despite its chief executive, rather than because of it or with his help. I think my personal opinion is that now Trump is the worst president, because I don't think we've ever had a more venal man in the office, and I don't think there's ever been anyone who who lied so relentlessly, casually, and consistently. I don't think. I think at some point there has to be there has to be a comeuppance there. I mean, you can't. I think if I think future historians, and we're seeing a lot of this going on in Ukraine with Russia and Putin, we're living in what I consider to be the age of lies, in which it is, for whatever reason, and the internet may have a lot to do with this, it is not possible for people in power to simply lie with impunity. They just lie and they keep saying the same lies over and over again, and they're not held accountable for various reasons that can be complicated. We have fetishized our First Amendment to a degree that, in many ways, we're shooting ourselves in the foot now. I don't know what to do about that, to be honest with you. I'm not a legal scholar, but you know, Donald Trump simply lied every day, consistently, constantly. He continues to, and as a prominent figure, as a man who's capable of not only stirring public opinion but moving wealth around, he's caused more damage alone than I think any president has in our history.
I don't know how you do. You have any comment about the current president's actions on, like, the Russia-Ukraine thing, for example, or letting? Well,
I think President Biden's biggest blunder so far has been his handling of the pullout from Afghanistan. I have the same opinion about Ukraine as I do about Afghanistan, and it's this: America spent all of its political capital, and this is important for people to remember, on the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and to a lesser degree its intervention in Libya and Syria, or lack thereof. And political capital is almost like a currency. And we've blown it so badly in Iraq, blew it so badly in Afghanistan, that our hands are tied when it comes to certain things. The first was staying in Afghanistan. Now, all of the options in Afghanistan were bad, all of them. There is no such thing at the beginning of Biden's presidency as a good option in Afghanistan. Had he stayed, we'd be flaying him for that. Had he pulled out, we'd be flaying him for it, and we are. We are flaying him for it because we're fickle. That is an unenviable position to be in, but either one was impossible. And sometimes that's what happens, especially in foreign policy. The other one is Ukraine. Fighting on the ground in Ukraine against Russia right now is impossible with American troops. It would lead to an escalation that, well, number one, we would never get there because the American people would never stomach it. It would be the end of, again, political capital. He doesn't have the political capital. We've spent it all. And so going into doing anything besides helping Ukraine's fighters and allies, and again, there are no good options. I don't think that's enough, but it's more than he can do. Because if he goes in with troops, that's, I think, tantamount to insane. I wish we could. I would like nothing more than to smite Vladimir Putin's military machine with military force. Personally, I dream of it every night. It's not possible. We don't live in that world. And so Biden's stuck with a problem. Number one, he's facing a megalomaniac who is shooting himself in the foot. Unfortunately, that's not going to, the results of that aren't going to be felt for probably years. I'm shocked at Putin's actions, but I don't see how Biden's hands. I don't see how Biden can do much more than he's doing right now. We'll see. He may screw this up, but that's my opinion on it.
Yeah. So another thing that's being talked about, is that Donald Trump may run again as president. And he has not officially announced that or confirmed that, but that's certainly a topic of conversation.
Yes.
Historically, it's interesting to note that to date, the only president who has served a term and then was not reelected, but then ran again and got reelected, was Grover Cleveland. So if Donald Trump were in fact going to run again and he were reelected, that would be something that hasn't been accomplished since like the 1890s.
Exactly. Yep. I think he'll probably win. I think if he runs, he'll win, because I don't see the Democrats putting up anybody who could defeat him. Biden, unless something dramatic happens between now and 2024, I think Biden will be in trouble. And I don't see the Democrats putting up, sort of thwarting his run with a primary run. And even if they did have a primary run, who would they run? That could be Trump. That's my personal take on it. But
yeah.
Again, it's early days.
As we kind of wrap up this conversation, Cormac, it's been I've enjoyed every word of it. Who is when you think of every president that we've had, is there one that you admire most?
I think it's FDR. I think Franklin Roosevelt, for one thing, proved. So this is something Lincoln did as well, very well. A lot of presidents did, but I think these two did it best. Franklin Roosevelt proved the worth of growing in the job. The man who assumed the presidency at the height of the Depression was not the man who died in 1944 in Georgia, and that's because this was a Mandarin. This was a man born of wealth. He was raised in luxury. He could have done anything he wanted, and he had a calling to do something about not just the disparities of the Depression, but American disparities in general. And then he gets into office, and he flounders. He's up against some pretty powerful headwinds, and he just keeps getting up and trying something else and trying something else. Some of it legally dubious, to be honest, but he keeps trying, and he also grows. And for example, he was not at all a man given to civil rights at the beginning of his presidency. Largely through his wife, he comes around, and he learns the value of doing something for the plight of African Americans and other minorities. It takes a while, but he learns, he grows, and I think he becomes this guy who, the eternal optimist, which of course is a stereotype of him, but it's true, and keeps smiling, keeps saying we'll get through this, and we're going to keep trying. We're going to do something. Government with executive leadership will do something, and we will find a way out of this. To be fair, World War II, Pearl Harbor, saved him from the Depression in a nutshell. But he was already making strides that I think were tremendous and significant to alleviating so much misery in the country.
Yeah. Well, Cormac, I appreciate your time today. The name of your book is Secret Lives of U.S. Presidents, and I think it's also important to note that you've also written a similar book about the First Ladies, Secret Lives of the First Ladies, and that's a whole other conversation we could have another time, but just real quick, anything you want to say about that book?
I will say this. I knew a lot less about the subject matter when I went into it, and it ended up being more fascinating. And I enjoyed writing it a little more, and it's full of a lot of surprises and some fascinating themes about quiet suffering.
Yeah. Wow. We'll have to talk again about that, because I'm sure there are some equally fascinating stories there that we could get into.
Very much. much so. I'd like that.
All right. Well, Cormac, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.